Good morning. My name is Bailey Chihan, and I'm a multimedia journalist at the Gazette. I want to thank you for spending your morning with us. And I want to thank ITC Midwest, our presenting sponsor for the Iowa Ideas Conference, and Kirkwood Community College, our keynote sponsor. This is the final session in the Curious Iowa track. Curious Iowa is a weekly Gazette series that answers readers' questions about our state, its people, and culture. The Gazette started Curious Iowa in May of 2023. And the series is driven by questions we receive from community members like you, like people wondering who picks up roadkill on the side of the road, where the Underground Railroad stops are in Iowa, or how often Iowa's rivers are cleaned, just to name a few. Readers submit these questions at thegazette.com/curious, and you can too. We fielded over 300 questions and answered more than 70. And to answer an audience question right off the bat, we receive about 10 to 20 every month. Today's conversation is an extension of a Curious Iowa story we published on Monday about what role lobbyists play in Iowa's lawmaking process. Before I move on, I want to remind you all to please use the chat throughout the session to submit questions you have for our panelists. The great thing about Iowa Ideas is that you can participate, so don't be shy. You will hear insights from the following people. Barbara Solberg is the Public Policy Strategist at the Cedar Rapids Metro Economic Alliance, a pro-growth business membership association. In the past, Barbara has served as a special assistant at the White House Office of Management and Budget during the George W. Bush administration. There, she served as a top advisor to the director in areas of economic policy, national security policy, strategic communications, and internal operations. Barbara began her career on Capitol Hill, where she spent 8 years working her way up to serve as the top staff person to Iowa Congressman Jim Nussle. Barbara led all legislative efforts and communications on his behalf. Brad Epperly is a practicing attorney and a founding partner of the lobbying firm CWL Group, a wholly owned subsidiary of the law firm Epperly & Miller, PLC. 18 of Brad's years as a practicing attorney focused primarily on government affairs. CWL Group provides government affairs representation to its clients in a wide range of industries. To name a few, this includes the grocery industry, utilities, economic development, insurance, agriculture, consumer data, and print and broadcast media. This includes the Iowa Newspaper Association, of which the Gazette is a member. And Melissa Peterson is the Legislative Director for the Iowa State Education Association, where she has proudly served Iowa's public education professionals since 2011. Prior to joining ISEA, she worked as a multi-client lobbyist and government relations consultant. Melissa represents the Iowa State Education Association on the IPERS Benefit Advisory Committee. Additionally, she is a founding member of Progress Iowa and is the vice president of the National Association of Legislative and Political Specialists for Education. So Barbara, this panel is made up of professional lobbyists, but there are folks in this virtual room who may be a lobbyist and they may not know it. So can you tell us who a lobbyist is?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, lots of answers probably. My role in the lobbying field is different than my fellow panelists a little bit, in that it's just a part of my job at the Economic Alliance, where I lead all the public policy initiatives that we champion or try to stop. But I would say anybody who's ever spoken to a legislator, a federal elected official, their congressman, their congresswoman, senator. If you go to Washington, D.C. to meet with them, or you go to the state capitol, you are lobbying them. So you don't have to be a professional paid lobbyist to be a lobbyist.
Yeah, Melissa, you've described lobbyists as professional advocates. Can you give us a brief idea of what a professional lobbyist does?
Sure. So a professional lobbyist will identify an issue that's important to their client. In my case, it's the Iowa State Education Association, who has a whole host of issues that they care about, whether it is education policy, labor policy, interested in state government, all kinds of issues. We identify the issues that are important to our members at the ISEA, and then we find helpful legislators who might share an interest in moving forward specific advocacy related to whatever that issue might be. So perhaps it's increasing funding for the public education system, or perhaps it's revising some sort of curriculum or standard issue, for example, You identify legislators, sometimes who sit on committees that are directly related to the Education Committee that we have in both the House and the Iowa Senate. And you find allies that will help you sponsor legislation to move forward to enter into the conversation. Or
Brad,
sometimes I will also say you do the opposite. You identify allies who can help you defeat things that have been proposed that are not in your client's best interest.
we'll talk more about that later. Brad, you're a multi-client lobbyist. How do you divide your attention between your clients during the legislative session?
Sure. So clients come in different varieties. Uh, the core of our representation, I would say, revolves around associations. So you mentioned the Iowa Newspaper Association, of which the Gazette is a member. And so members in an industry like the newspaper industry form an association and do various things beyond government affairs. So that, that's the core. And those are the most hands-on because the associations are expected to carry the ball for their members on these types of things. And then you have another type of client, which is, say, a national client, a large corporation that will have an active internal government affairs department, and they will have representation in the various states. Some are more concerning to them than others. So maybe a national ag client will have a distinct interest in a state like Iowa, which is heavily ag. And so in terms of how, we split time on that, there is a limit, obviously a theoretical limit on the amount of time that you have in every given day. And as a senior lobbyist mentioned to me, which I thought was somewhat simple at the time, but its simplicity is proven to be true time and again, and that is every session is different. So it just depends. We have sessions that are there is a broad array of legislation that doesn't have necessarily big pushes and priorities, and then there are others that are front-loaded, like the 2022 session, where we had governor's priorities and caucus priorities that were front-loaded, and so we play on the field that the legislature sets. By and large, we play a part in that, setting that field. But by and large, we react to what comes before us and act accordingly.
So we sometimes hear the swamp as the term used to describe lobbying in Washington, D.C. Barbara, you worked on Capitol Hill for a long time, and now you work as a lobbyist in Iowa. Can you compare the two and tell us about the level of transparency that Iowa requires of its lobbyists?
Compare the two. They're not very similar. Other than, talking about issues that you want to see passed or stopped. I think I spoke to you about this before, but when coming from being lobbied in DC and then moving back home to Iowa and then working for the Economic Alliance and then doing the lobbying on the other side of the fence, I was pleasantly surprised how transparent and it was like a world apart of how the transparency is in Iowa, the system which Iowa tracks bills and how lobbyists use the system is night and day. It's ironic that it's 2024 and the federal government can't figure out how to do something that Iowa's been doing for a long time. But it is a very transparent system that anybody can log on. It doesn't have to be a professional lobbyist. Anybody can log on and see who is championing a bill or working against the bill, who is on committees, who you need to speak to. It's really a citizen participant system that we have in Iowa, which I would say is the largest difference. It's harder for an average person to be a true lobbyist in DC versus here.
Yeah, Brad, do you want to expand on registering your position on a bill, the ability to track a bill in a system, that sort of thing?
Yeah, and that has improved over time just with technology at the Iowa Capitol. Today, we are leaps and bounds ahead of just 18 years ago when I started doing some of this work. But yeah, the process where a lobbyist works on a piece of legislation, first of all, if there's a bill filed and you anticipate speaking to a legislator, you register for whatever client you're representing on that, and you're to register a position, which is for, against, or undecided. And that can be tricky because bills change over time. But the key there is I'm not supposed to talk to anybody of the 150 people that are up there on any bill unless I have registered, even if that's undecided, which you see a lot of because it is a work in progress most of the time in that. And they've added things, and this is all online. You can look up every registration that I've had every year for going back probably 18 years. But there is also an opportunity because sometimes bills are quite large. Tax bills, as a for instance, can be quite large and encompassing. And for instance, we use the Newspaper Association again. If there was going to be a tax addressed to advertising in newspapers, that might be part of a 40-page bill, but the Newspaper Association only cares about that one little section. And so there's a comment section there to identify. I mean, we might rush in there and say, oh, we're against something like that and begin to lobby against, but we're not lobbying against the whole bill. And that gets sort of confusing, I think. From time to time, I will receive a random phone call, not random, but the person does not know us, asking about our registration on a particular bill. And they just, there's only so much information you can put on there for the public to be aware of how and what you're working on in a particular bill. But it's really, really transparent. And, I think too, the lobby is somewhat self-policing too. It might be surprising for people to hear that, but we all know one another. We all get along. And when somebody's not registered, and sometimes it's just an oversight, another lobbyist will mention that to them. Hey, you're not registered on that. And usually the reaction is, oh gosh, thank you. And they get it on there.
Yeah, Melissa, we talked about undecided. When you register as undecided on a bill, what does that mean for you?
Yeah, so undecided, some people refer to it as neutral. It doesn't mean that I don't have an opinion. It just means that the bill needs improvement or adjustments need to be made in order for me to either decide to support that legislation or to ultimately end up registering as against or opposed to that legislation. And so that position of undecided is really a space where usually it means it's something that we have in the works, right? We're communicating with legislators, we're communicating with other lobbyists or representatives of organizations to see what change we need to see made on that bill. Or if changes are not something that we think is going to be adopted, or if people are not finding our arguments persuasive, we will maintain a position of undecided or neutral, very rarely, but up to kind of final passage, because maybe there is something in there that we do like, but there is something in there we don't like. So, for example, maybe it's a bill that does combine an increase in educator salaries, for example, but also includes dramatic reforms to AEAs. Those things, there can be positives and there can also be downsides to legislation. And so it's usually one of two reasons why you pick an undecided or a neutral registration. But again, you're still actively engaged in the legislation. You're just not picking we think that this is great or we are absolutely opposed to it.
Let's turn to the legislative session. Those are some long hours at the Capitol. For some of you aren't there every single day. Melissa, what's kind of a typical week in the session? Is there a typical week?
I will say it really kind of depends upon the timeline for legislative session. One of the good things from a scheduling perspective is that traditionally our days during the session, which has a usual 100 or 110-day calendar, which, by the way, we can often exceed, or sometimes we can accelerate. The only real obligation is to make sure that the legislature has passed a budget by June 30th. In preparation for the next fiscal year. So traditionally, the timeline has us beginning the second Monday of January. And then, for example, in the off year, we'll have a 110-day calendar. So that's what we're looking at for 2025, which would put kind of tentative adjournment for, I believe, the third or fourth week of April here coming up. And this last year, I think tentative adjournment date was going to be the 16th or 17th with the 100-day calendar. And we ended up, I believe, adjourning on the 20th, the 19th or 20th. And so we kind of met those deadlines, but there are different benchmarks throughout the legislative calendar when bills have to be filed, when bills can be considered only in the chamber of their origin, for example. And so those really usually have a tendency to intensify the schedule. But on Mondays, they do not gavel in until 1 p.m. So it's a good opportunity to get up there and talk to people before the week's work officially begins. But when we are really moving in a calendar, especially in a year when folks have lots of priorities, you can start your workday at 7:30 in the morning with a subcommittee and find yourself in a committee meeting until 7:30 or 8 o'clock, if not later, because of the way the committee blocks have been scheduled. Now, I will say schedule adjustments have been made since the pandemic when things were moved virtually. And I have appreciated each chamber kind of establishing new rules to only have subcommittees between particular windows or attempting to only have a committee, for example, meet in the Senate in one specific room and during specific blocks. The good news about that is it provides a bit more predictability to our calendars daily at the legislature. The bad news is if your work, the committee work exceeds the block, for example, in the state Senate, you don't get to reconvene until every other committee has met. And so that's what can make for some really long nights. But it's predictably unpredictable depending upon the activity that takes place in those subcommittees or committees.
Brad, can you tell me a little bit about what role lobbyists play in those subcommittees? Do you speak at them? Do you just attend to monitor?
Yeah, so like everything for lobbyists up there, there are varying degrees of training prior to that. So as lawyers, I mean, I was in full litigation type practice in the 13 plus years prior to this. So that's my background. I'm comfortable with that. Others, not necessarily, because there's plenty of non-lawyers up there and also very good at what they do. And so you may see them just read a statement. The most fun, I mean, again, as a lawyer by training, the most fun for me in a subcommittee is, are we going to go back and forth with the other side? And do we have those kinds of exchanges? And I look forward to those, and not just because, it's advocacy back and forth that, harkens back to, courtroom days, but because you flesh out ideas, I think that way. I think the subcommittees have become more and more of a sort of perfunctory exercise where everybody goes in, just states their position, they close it up and move on. The thing about a subcommittee where you're working on a bill for or against, or even just, helping it to get better in some regards, is you want to do your work before the subcommittee and then after the subcommittee. And what that means is there are typically a subcommittee is 3 members, 2 from the majority caucus and 1 from the minority caucus. And you want to touch base with them individually prior to the subcommittee. So you can explain for or against, where your client's positions are, the whys. And then afterwards, after you've, heard from the other side, I'm one who I don't think there is any advantage gained in lobbying not to seek out the other side before and afterwards. And the legislators always appreciate it. I mean, what you see and hear oftentimes is, 2 parties fighting back and forth, but they'll both tell you when you are representing someone, hey, have you talked to the other side? Is there a way we can work this out? And again, for me, that's where the job is the most interesting and enjoyable for me is, okay, they've got a problem. I want this. How can I fix it? And I mean, I've drafted a couple years ago on an issue that I started with an initial draft that had all kinds of opposition. We went full circle and ended up right back where I started. And that's fine. I drafted a lot of amendments, but it fleshed out for the other side. Oh, okay, I see. Yeah. And then they became more and more comfortable with the original language in the end. So subcommittees are good for, sort of getting the ball started, so to speak. They're not as good as they used to be in terms of getting the information out there, but that's on us. I mean, we need to seek out not only legislators, but other lobbyists on the other side.
Barbara, why is it important to catch a legislator before they head into subcommittee or catch them immediately after?
Yeah, I would like to say that I have mad respect for these two that are there every day during session, their long hours, and really the legislators really one of the other really neat things about our system is that legislators really rely on the lobby for the expertise, right? They're representing their industry where they have an expertise. And legislators, there's thousands and thousands of bills that are introduced every session, and they can't possibly know everything. So it really is a system where the everybody works together in the good. Most for the most part, they work together to get the best product at the end. Brad is a lobbyist for an organization that the Economic Alliance is a part of, the Iowa Chamber Alliance. So I work with Brad quite a bit, and it's really they do a great job. And like I said to you before, like grabbing them before they go in, it's all the same thing. It's making sure that your members, your association's voices are heard. It's really important to build those relationships before, so they don't look at you like, who the heck are you? They understand who you're representing and what you can do to help them. And I think for the most part, almost all the legislators really do look to the lobby to help them get the best product in the end.
Do you feel like lawmakers listen?
Yes and no. I mean, sometimes, just being honest, sometimes there's an agenda that's set and that's what they're going to do. And you all the best you can do is, make sure they listen to you and um, or at least hear you. They might not take what you say and change their mind, but it's baby steps. These things don't always happen overnight, and it really, if you don't have those relationships to start with, it's not going to matter at all. So it is important. I do think they listen, but sometimes the outcome is predetermined. But that's kind of the game that we play.
Melissa, I'm curious your response. Do lawmakers listen?
Yes. The question is to who? And I think that is it's always a question. I think that generally speaking, all legislators that I interact with on a regular basis are very interested in what their constituents think about things, as well as organizations that they respect, that they might be directly involved in. Uh, to Barbara's point, I mean, legislators really do look to members in the lobby to help identify what's important to their particular group. These folks they're not necessarily the experts on the committees in which they serve, right? They might serve on the education committee, but they might not be an educator. They might be on the ag committee, but they might not be a farmer or someone who's involved in the industry. And so they turn to other experts to help them educate themselves and their fellow legislators. However, it's not just lobbyists that have agendas. There are other elected officials that have agendas. There are other, just the influence of national politics, for example, the influence of, other things that are happening out in society and across the world can influence the process as well. And so part of the listening is the importance of subcommittees, going back to what Brad was talking about. I think subcommittees are really important for transparency, because that's where members of the public, if they're interested on a particular piece of legislation, again, particularly after the pandemic, can log into the virtual opportunities to either participate, as is the case with the Senate, or to observe, as is the case with the House. And so it gives folks an opportunity to weigh in and to have their voices heard. how things shake out ultimately is just influenced by so many different factors. But they do listen. It's just a matter of who can be the most persuasive for a whole host of reasons.
Brad, so I mentioned at the top that this session is an extension of a story that we published on Monday. And Brad, you kind of said a similar thing in that story about, lawmakers are sometimes put on some committees where they're not experts. And you were talking about that within the context of clients financially backing some candidates. I wondered if you wanted to talk about that and how that doesn't equate to buying a vote.
Yeah, I mean, this is Iowa. I mean, the transparent, it all starts with the transparency. Our gift law has been around it predates me. Up there, it is $2.99. So you can't buy a Happy Meal anymore for that. And so the interaction, I mean, there's good and there's bad to that, because that's, it's kind of how you get to know people, is, breaking bread with them, sharing a drink with them. And so that part of it is good, and it takes time, because legislators, when they're first elected, some of them have already been elected to office, right? They've been a county supervisor, maybe a council person, a mayor, a school board member, any time. And so they've had that kind of interaction with the public, and they're comfortable with it. Others, it might be their first foray into politics, and none of these folks at the state level start out as professional politicians. We don't go year round, right? I mean, but I was counting this year, because I was with the retirements that we had occurred, and the incumbents that were there when I started in my first session in 2007, of the 150 people, I think I counted 8 that were still there. I mean, there is turnover. And so there's this, people come in, there's the lobby is scary for some of them. And really, at the end of the day, and my sort of stock line to all freshmen, particularly if they are uncomfortable, is if you're not utilizing the lobby, you're making a mistake, because you're wasting a resource. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with them. It doesn't even mean that you have to accept the arguments and the positions they take, but you should take in the information. And I will say, too, that there is a culture up there, too, that as a lobbyist, you don't get a second chance to present information that's not accurate. I think you need to be very careful about presenting someone else's arguments and information. You want to be very clear, the basis for saying that. But if you stray down a path that is just not accurate, that can get around pretty fast. And your reputation is what you're basing everything that you do now and in the future. And it's not that you can't recover from that, but it's not easy.
Yeah, building relationships is a really important part of the work that you do, and building relationships specifically on both sides of the aisle. Melissa, do you want to talk about your experiences with that?
Sure. So it is something that I think is perhaps uniquely challenging for someone like myself, who represents the largest public employees union in the state, who is an affiliate of a national organization that some people have some preconceived notions about. I will say my organization also has a political arm. We have a political action committee that does engage in electoral politics to support pro-public education elected officials up and down the ballot based off of a process that is directed by our membership. And when you have particularly a political side too, there can be some preconceived notions, rightly or wrongly, about one's ability to communicate across the aisle. And so that's something at the Iowa State Education Association we've really been working on over the course of the last few years, as we have seen issues that affect public education in particular really taking more of a partisan bent, which is not good for our membership. That really resembles the state in terms of party registration. And so, as I think I mentioned in the article at ISEA, we like to say it's not about the D, it's not about the R, it's about the E for education. And I will say that I have really enjoyed, for someone who's been doing this work for a while, really enjoyed the opportunity to get to know people on both sides of the aisle better, learning how other people think, and how they view things. In some cases, you find out that there are preconceived notions or stereotypes they have about you and the organization you work for that can be easily dispelled. And then with some, it's not so easy, and they don't find you as persuasive despite the evidence. But it's important work, particularly when we think about, well, we might be under a political trifecta now as it applies to state government. That's not the environment I started in. And I think Iowans generally like balanced government. And so being able to communicate across party lines, and also across chambers, they communicate differently in each chamber, right? So being able to kind of navigate that space and become a trusted resource for legislators, regardless of their party affiliation or which chamber they're in, is really important for success.
Barbara, you shared with me that in one week you were yelled at by both sides of the aisle. Tell me how you navigate building relationships.
Um, well, I try to be as truthful as possible with when I talk to folks. I don't try to shy away from our stance on issues, and we we're really lucky in at the business community. I think had such an array of issues that it doesn't really matter who's in leadership, who's calling the shots. We can typically find issues that we align with leadership, with those that are passing the laws for the most part. But I think just having, in Lynn County, we have the majority of our legislators are Democrats, where the leadership and those calling the shots in Des Moines are Republicans. So it's really important that we cross over, that we don't just concentrate on one side of the aisle, that you really build relationships that are lasting, so that when the pendulum swings or when you need help, or legislators also rely on us to help them move the needle sometimes, just because of the constituency of the business community can be influential in communities. So I think just being truthful and transparent and being willing to help them is kind of the route that I usually take.
So Brad, you're a multi-client lobbyist. Melissa, you were a multi-client lobbyist prior to joining the ISEA. Have you ever run into a time where you personally disagreed with what a client was working towards? How do you balance the job and your personal beliefs, and how do you work through those challenges?
Not yet. I think it's twofold for me. One is you do a thoughtful screening process when considering accepting new representation. It is not fair because everybody deserves to be heard. I mean, the running joke of a lobbyist is, I'm a First Amendment advocate. It's right in there among the 5 rights that we have, and one is to petition your government. Having said that, the other part of it is I'm a lawyer by training, and everybody deserves, it goes back to that, everybody deserves representation part. The challenging thing with bringing on clients in something that you wouldn't necessarily personally believe in is, I mean, that at the end of the day, that has to, that there has to be a feeling for that, right? I mean, and it would be reflective, I think, in your efforts, quite frankly. So you just have to do a good job in identifying potential clients. The challenge, I interrupted myself, the challenge where you bring on new client is you have to think about it, and this is the unfairness that I started to reference. You have to think about it in reference to your other clients. So, take some of the social issues, which are, lightning rod issues. It's not fair, but were I advocating on some of these, on a social issue, for instance, and I'm also advocating for or against something on behalf of the Grocers Association. Well, an individual legislator may, take that dislike for the social issue I'm representing one client on out on me with respect to the grocers. And I can't have that. That's not fair to the grocers or any other client. So for the most part, it comes in on the front end. To not completely dodge your question, if that day were come where something like that occurred, I think it would it'd have to be treated much like we treat potential conflicts that sometimes arise, and that would just simply be full disclosure to the client and have a discussion. It might be something that we might have to refer the client out to someone else for representation if we thought that we would be challenged in presenting it.
And I would just piggyback off of that and say that in my current position, I have never been asked to take a position on something I did not agree with. We are compensated for this work, right? We're hired to do a particular job. I will say one of the reasons why I moved from being a multi-client lobbyist to being an in-house lobbyist was primarily two factors. We represented a client, I think we had 27 the last year that I worked for the multi-client firm. And when I had to go to the Department of Economic Development to announce a third plant closure, you have to notify government when you, quite frankly, cut a certain number of positions. When I had to do that the third time on behalf of one client, it didn't make me feel great as a human being. It was my job and I did my job. I fulfilled my commitment, but I started looking for other opportunities. I will also say, and I have great respect for the Brad Epperleys of our world, because they have to be kind of the jack of all trades. They have to know a bit about a ton of different issues and subjects. I really like the idea of working for my organization because I will never know everything there is to know about education policy, but it really provides me an opportunity to really dive quite deep into my issues. And then state government, because it's so fun, has moved some of the responsibilities of education to different departments and committees. And so I get to learn a lot about other things as well. But it also goes back to what both of my colleagues have previously said. This is about reputation. It is about responsibility. It's about being truthful and building solid relationships. And it's okay to say when you don't agree with something or when you perhaps aren't as passionate moving forward on an issue, but we, at the end of the day, have to deliver for our clients. And in my case, that's 30,000 members across the state of Iowa who all represent diverse opinions. But that's the job.
Thanks for sharing that. I want to go back a little bit because I thought this was really interesting when you shared it with me, Melissa. You were talking about where you sit in the Capitol and how that can influence who you talk to or the information that you can gather. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, it is. It might seem silly, but the amount of information you can gather just by watching your colleagues and elected officials, with all due respect, scurry into different locations, really can help you understand who is a player, what issue might be moving, who's not being included in those conversations, and it even helps you gauge the speed with which the legislative session is moving. So I referenced in the article, I have a particular one of the not so great things about being a lobbyist is even for those of us that have done this work for decades, we don't have designated space at the State House. We don't get a locker. We don't get a place to put our stuff. So you kind of claim sections of territory, and we can be a little territorial. And I deliberately position myself usually toward the chamber I am working the closest with and in a place where I can see foot traffic. So whether that's the cafeteria, I will tell you, I set my things in that area because I can see and catch people coming down the house stairway who's getting food. Oh, excuse me, representative, I need to talk to you if I haven't caught them earlier. And I also, from my vantage point, can see who's coming in and out of the governor's office on the basement floor. But you can also see the same thing if you're hanging out on the rail up on the second floor where a lot of lobbyists hang out. Who's heading to what subcommittee? What legislators are coming out and actually talking to constituents and lobbyists that are in the building that day? And so it's not rocket science, but it's just watching human behavior and knowing enough about putting the puzzle pieces together. It also is a good opportunity to see some of the special guests that are coming into the Capitol, whether that is heads of organizations that are not registered lobbyists or other elected officials that are invited into our state to provide additional perspectives. Or in my case, we had some really kind of tumultuous issues pop up in 2023 related to the education savings account plan. When I started seeing national advocates for that, I knew we were in trouble, right? Because it just, but putting that all together also adds kind of a strategic and fun element. I like the rebuttal too, Brad, of a subcommittee that sometimes we get fulfilled, but sometimes we don't. The strategy of figuring out who's going where and matching up those puzzle pieces can also be a fun element that's also quite informative for the work that we do.
Before I move on to work that happens outside of this session, anything else that you want to add that you want our audience to know about what goes on during a legislative session?
Is that for the group?
Yep, for the group.
Well, I would just say from a process standpoint, just briefly, and it was mentioned, but the term has not been used, and that is the funnels. If you hear somebody talk about funnels in a legislative session, that means bills have to pass a certain, they have to get by a certain amount of the process by certain dates. So the first funnel is through a committee of origin. So you've gone through a subcommittee and then a committee, and you have to keep moving these through. Otherwise, they die. And the purpose of those funnels is to sort of sort out what are live rounds and what aren't. So the legislative process starts with a lot of subcommittees early on. It moves into a lot of committee work, and then you got floor debate, goes back and forth. So there's a real flow to a session, and they are, as I said earlier, they are all different. Because things can get bogged down over a great big issue taking air out of the building, and so then you don't see progress. But it's intended to be functional. It's intended to make you work to achieve certain benchmarks throughout the process. And the last thing you want to do, and for me, this last year was 3 a.m. in the chambers, in the gallery, watching my last piece of legislation go through. Because it had gotten slowed down. You want to have your work done by the time they get into those last 2 weeks and they're making budget deals and so forth.
Yeah, I would say that another one of my moments when I was like, the light bulb, wow, why doesn't Washington, D.C. do this? Is like when I learned about the funnel system, it's so efficient. It's so it makes things progress. It makes them get things done. So that was just another one of my moments of vast differences between the two capitals.
Yeah.
I think I would just add that people should not be afraid of lobbyists. We are a resource, and it's important to acknowledge too that there are lobbyists who are attorneys by trade. There are lobbyists who are former legislators. There are also some really, really good and effective lobbyists who started out as just constituents who had an issue with a child or a parent or an issue of their own passion, whether it's related to mental health or like all kinds of things. Some of the best advocates are people who were not lobbyists by training, who weren't involved in politics. And so don't be intimidated by lobbyists, just as you shouldn't be intimidated by legislators. These people are just like everybody else, right? And as long as you can communicate passionately about the subject that you are looking to affect, we're all in this together, and the whole idea is to make Iowa better for whatever our particular issue area might be.
Sure. Brad, let's talk about drafting bills with your clients and picking out the goals for the upcoming session. You've told me that you've spoken about this earlier in the session about working with the opposition and not hiding the ball. How do you draft around conflict, and why is it important to work with the other side early on?
Usually you get a better product. First of all, legislators, the vast majority of interest groups up there are not partisan interest groups by any stretch of the imagination. So what that means is that when there is a conflict between two, competing groups, industries, whatever it might be, on a piece of legislation, legislators want, they've got friends on both sides. They want you to work it out. So the first thing that typically occurs, and most legislation that's drafted is association based, is the association's members meet, they identify a particular issue they're having in their industry, whatever that may be. Here's the code sections or the regulatory portions that are causing those problems. Here's how we draft it. And then, after you get through that process, going through code regulation, putting pen to paper and getting a working draft product, then you step back and look at it and say, okay, who's going to have a problem with this? And that's when you start reaching out to opponents, other interest groups, because what you want to be able to say is before you go to, and your conversations with legislators are often leadership, committee chairs, maybe floor manager, potential people. They're going to ask, have you talked to the other side? Right. And you should, at the very least, say, not yet, but that is on our list of things to do. I want to touch base with you on this first, or yes, I have, and we're working on it. Not everything can be drafted around. I like that challenge in situations. I mean, and sometimes those things take years to pass because of it, and you have to be patient. Because there's another phrase that, our founders didn't make this process easy. They didn't make it so that stuff could be passed. They actually set up the process so stuff couldn't be passed very easily. So the fact that things don't get done is normal. And so working with the other side, I think, gets a better product. If you ask any lobbyist who's been up there through the various, I started when it was a D trifecta for 4 years. And then I think we had 4 years of split control. And then we've had the Republican trifecta now for, I think, 8 sessions. You ask a lobbyist what most fun they had, and it was when it was split control. And that's not a knock on either one of them, because you have to think about how to work through your issue on things that now, the parties may look at differently. And, that's the creative part about what we do, and figuring out the language and the persuasion that goes with getting it accomplished.
Yeah, Barbara, tell me about, session's been over, we're gearing up for the next one. What are you doing at this time of year?
Yeah, so we, with our organization, the Economic Alliance, we have 1,200 members. So that's a very diverse constituency, if you will. And so a lot of my time, and from anywhere from nonprofits to hospitals to a small bookstore to manufacturers, city municipalities. So a lot of my time is spent listening to those stakeholders and members to see, kind of give them a lay of the land of what happened during session, what we kind of expect for next session, the focus of legislators and the governor, and then just listening to folks, getting a sense of which direction they want us to go in or continue in. Like Brad said, whenever somebody brings me something new, I always say of course I listen, and then I always ask who's against this and why, because it helps me to get over hurdles that are going to come. And so we spend a lot of time just listening to folks, building that agenda, talking to my peers across the state, relying on our lobbyists like Brad in the Chamber Alliance, and just taking all that input, which ends up being like a 6-page document that I know no legislator, let alone most of my colleagues, will ever read, because it's just too much and we all have a lot to read. So we have to dwindle that down to just 5 or 6 things that we want to talk about. So it's getting the consensus to get to that, to get to those 5 or 6 items, which takes time and patience and lots of listening and lots of driving to go to meet with folks. Listening to legislators too, like that's important for me to have those meetings to get their sense of what's their priorities for the next session, how we can work together to get mutual things accomplished.
And Brad, wording is so important, right? Tell us
Absolutely.
about having control over the document.
Yeah, for me, that is something that, again, goes back to, legal practice days. And that is when you write something, of course, things can be written and come out in a way that you don't intend, but If you're careful and thoughtful and thorough, then the words that you put on the page are intentional. Um, if you are, if someone else is drafting an amendment, or someone else just flat out drafting the bill, right? You don't necessarily know what was in their head and what they intended, and they might tell you what it is they intended, but again, they can make errors as well with their intent, and you have the vaunted unintended consequences that comes about. So I just think it's always like I said, with if I'm involved in something with a client that we have a very specific goal. If we're putting forth the legislation, even if somebody drafts me an amendment, oftentimes I will rewrite the amendment to the extent that I think there's language in there that can be better worded, because it does matter. And I mean, I've drafted amendments myself that a regulator told me after it had been enacted and they were passing rules, no, that's not how we see it. And of course, I chuckled and said, well, I'm the one who wrote it, so this is how it was intended to be. That occurs, and it's occurred to me a couple times. And you come back the next session with language to fix it and address the complications that occurred because of simple wording.
Melissa, I saw you nodding along. Is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I would just, it happens all the time. I will say also, when you're dealing with particularly, I would say, legislators or staff, we are so fortunate to have a very active, engaged, nonpartisan legislative service agency that assists elected officials and folks like us to a certain degree in actually drafting things. But we have a relatively new crew. Some of the more experienced folks have retired, and it's just interesting. People hear things differently, and sometimes you don't know what you don't know, right? Until you've drafted something or had something drafted and been like, this is not reflective at all of the conversation that you had either with a legislator or with a staff member. So you really have to kind of keep your eye on that process and make sure everybody understands as best as possible. And to Brad's point, that's one of the reasons why you hope most of your work is done before we get to that second funnel, because after that, things move very, very quickly, and people's capacity to identify inaccuracies or unintentional inclusions is greatly reduced. And so you always have to kind of watch the moving pieces to ensure that whatever is moved forward is reflective of your intentions.
We're getting down to the last couple of minutes here, so I'm going to end with this question of what page from Iowa's book could Washington, D.C. take to improve the transparency of lobbying? And this is for anybody.
Well, I mean, I'll go briefly because I don't have DC experience, but we've talked about some of these things. The bill registration process that is in place in Iowa certainly provides a great deal of transparency. You have to ask yourself, it's timeless, really. I mean, does it feel right? Does it, when you're doing something, and in Iowa, that's pretty easy because it's all pretty well spelled out for you what you can and can't do. And when you see congressional people, and I certainly don't want to broad brush everyone, but when you see them enter elected office in DC, and they're not wealthy people, and by the time they leave, they are, something's not right there. So whether it's restrictions on investments that they can do, whether it's the gift law, I'm sure there's always ways around things, but I mean, sunshine is always better. Transparency is an antiseptic that the state of Iowa has really figured out. I mean, it's really pretty retail around here and pretty straightforward.
Well, I would say also, they should level the playing field. Anyone can register as a lobbyist in the state of Iowa, right? I mean, anyone can engage in this process. If you come to visit the state capitol and you want to have a conversation with a legislator or other, entities related to a specific issue, we make it, I think, as easy as possible to do that. And your voice can be heard in that subcommittee process. as loudly as someone else who might have a really, really, multi-million-dollar organization standing behind them. And so I think that's something that our federal government could definitely benefit from.
And I think the first thing for me would be the technology that we utilize in Iowa to shine a light on the system and how and who's talking to who and what stance everyone has on an issue. The subcommittees, the subcommittee process here in Iowa is that doesn't exist in DC. There is no, you can't talk from the audience and you'll get kicked out of a hearing for good reasons, but sometimes. But I mean, just everything from the ability to when you trigger when you're triggered to register, or you don't even register as a lobbyist, but become a lobbyist in DC, like the threshold is very different than it is in Iowa, like Melissa said. So there's from the process to technology, just that's probably the biggest thing is technology could be utilized. That could be an instant, pretty quickly done change that they could make.
Sure. Well, I want to thank our panelists and audience for spending their morning with us. And I also want to thank our presenting sponsor, ITC Midwest, and our keynote sponsor, Kirkwood Community College, once again for sponsoring Iowa Ideas. This is the final session in the Curious Iowa track, but you can stay engaged by submitting your questions about our state, its people, and culture at thegazette.com/curious. We also have a Curious Iowa newsletter, which keeps you up to date with the newest Curious Iowa stories. You can also sign up for that free newsletter at thegazette.com/curious. Our final keynote speaker, climber Jen Loeb, is speaking this afternoon at 1. That's sure to be a very inspiring conversation. You can tune in just the same way that you tuned in for this conversation. That's all I have. So thank you all and have a great day.